Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. Before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to just say something about the co-sponsors of this event, the Department of Asian and International Studies and the Southeast Asia Research Center. The Department of Asian and International Studies, or AIS, is quite an unusual department in Hong Kong. At CityU, multidisciplinary scholars from 15 countries speaking 20 different languages. We have a very interesting and diverse PhD program. And the focus of this department is on explaining Asia in Hong Kong, in a cosmopolitan city, from an international and comparative perspective. We have experts on the region in social sciences and humanities, and our aim is to make this understandable in Hong Kong, but also to explain it in a larger international context. The Center for Southeast Asian Studies, or SEARC, is the only such center in Hong Kong. There are a number of Southeast Asians living here in Hong Kong. Hong Kong is in the middle of Southeast Asia. But of course, attention has shifted recently, for understandable reasons, to the north. But we at the center are pointing out the importance of the region itself, and we have about 30 scholars from a number of different departments working on this region. So it's this center and the department which have come together to put together this Eminent Scholar Series lecture, very much in the spirit of a comparative international understanding of Asia, and in this case, of Hong Kong. So I'd like to introduce our speaker, Jack Goldstone, who has just recently arrived in Hong Kong and is the director of the Hong Kong UST Institute for Public Policy and the Elman Family Professor of Public Policy. Many of you will know Jack's work, which has won a number of major prizes from prestigious associations. He's also received such prestigious fellowships as from the Guggenheim Foundation and the MacArthur Foundations. His current research focuses on the impact of population change on the global economy and international security and the cultural origins of economic growth, but some of you will know his earlier work on revolutions, which of course was path-breaking and synthesized the field and has been a great influence on many of us here. He's authored or edited 10 books and published over 100 articles. So in this metric-driven academic age, Jack, you prove a model that we all wish to follow. His most recent books are The Rise of the West, 1500-1850, which is in Chinese translation in 2010, as well as its original McGraw-Hill publication 2008, Political Demography, Oxford 2012, and also from Oxford, Revolutions, A Very Short Introduction. Jack, it's a great pleasure to have you here. Thanks for coming on such short notice, and we look forward to your talk that's very relevant to what's happening here in Hong Kong. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark, and thanks for everyone for coming today. I am a newcomer. I still feel a bit like a guest here in Hong Kong. And I'm very impressed with City University and with this center, with its international scope and with the quality of scholarship here. So I'm delighted to come and have a chance to exchange views with all of you. I am, as a newcomer, no expert on Hong Kong. But the theme of my talk comes because almost as soon as I arrived here, one of the things I was impressed with is how unhappy everyone tells me they are with Hong Kong. So something is clearly not working here. And I'm going to try and use the research that I've done on political stability and on democracy to try and illuminate some of the trends that I think are important. But I'm anxious to get your feedback as well and learn from your views. The research that informs my talk today is a study that was published in 2010 in the American Journal of Political Science. It was a study designed to help governments forecast the onset of political crises. We looked at all cases. It was actually a large multidisciplinary team of about 14 core scholars and contributions from several others. We looked at all cases of civil war, revolution, and democratic failures, coups d'etats or collapse of democracy, backsliding, since 1955. And we tested causal models using political, economic, environmental, demographic, and social factors as independent variables. We used a variety of techniques, including regression and neural networks eventually settled on a small sample regression design that allowed us to look both at the historical data and to segregate the data into different portions so that we could do some retrodiction on split samples. And because it was a long-term project, thankfully, we were even able to do some actual forecasting tests. Now, the chart that we published to summarize the research, probably hard for you to read. I tried to play with type size and all that, but I will try and make it simple for you. It's all about factionalism. I'll have to go back and forth from the mic since folks sitting in back, but I'll try and cover this. It's all about factionalism. What does that mean? Most variables we looked at turned out to have very little effect on this wide range of political crises. The onsets could be very largely and successfully predicted by looking at only a small number of factors. If you can see on the bottom there, the accuracy was about 80% overall, and even higher, about 87%, looking just at democratic reversals, what we called adverse regime changes. Now that's remarkably high accuracy, but it turned out that a lot of that even depended on one variable in particular. So the four general variables we looked at: regime type, partial autocracies are indeed, this characteristic of states. They're not fully democracies, they're not fully dictatorships. They have a mix of characteristics, sometimes called anocracies, hybrids, partial democracies. They are somewhat less stable than either the pure democratic or autocratic regimes. But the partial democracy with factionalism, those are the ones, this group here, that were really vulnerable to change. Now these odds ratios, it's an indication of the size of the effect. You can see the odds ratios here are generally single digits. This one's 37, 28.5, 157. So this variable here is unusually powerful in forecasting regime changes. The partial democracies without factionalism, they're also more inclined to fail, but on a much more moderate level. Full democracies, a little more stable than autocracies, although they are vulnerable to loss of democracy. And infant mortality, which is a measure of economic development, surprisingly significant, but not very large in its impact. So yes, richer countries are less likely to have an impact, but it turns out that among poor countries, there's a huge variation in the countries that are able to sustain democracy and those that are not. And that accounts for the relatively low weight of infant mortality. We're not just comparing rich and poor countries, but among poor countries, the regime type has a much bigger effect. Then armed conflict in neighboring states matters, and state-led discrimination also matters. So you have ethnic conflicts arising where you have discrimination. So none of that was really unexpected except for this very large effect. And it turns out that when you think about that, it's not that unexpected. What the data is telling us is that when you have democracy and free expression, you can manage conflict. When you have a fairly powerful and pure form of autocracy, a party state, a military dictatorship, they're generally able to suppress opposition for quite a long time. When you have a partial democracy, though, you have an opening up to create a limited space for organized opposition, then conflict comes out in the open. What then determines whether a country moves forward or not? If the various political actors are able to reach agreements, compromise, move forward, for example, as Tunisia has done after its recent revolution, then you have a chance for democracy to survive. But if the various political factions cannot work together, cannot compromise, if they are factionalized or polarized, letting conflict out into the open through partial democracy is simply an invitation to heightened conflict, deadlock, and often actions to undermine the democratic institutions. So that makes a fair bit of sense and forced us to say, okay, well, what do we know about factionalism? How do we recognize it in a particular country? Generally, you see factionalism where you have very rigid party identifications. What that means is you can predict the majority of a legislator's vote, for example, simply by knowing their party label. So you know that the Democrats will vote Democrat on, if you have a Democratic president, if the Democrats vote with the president 95% of the time, that's very rigid. Or if the Republicans vote against the president 95% of the time, that's fairly rigid. That's what we're getting in the United States these days. A very strong type of rigid party identification. Didn't used to be like that. It used to be that you had large, diverse parties, and on any given issue, yes, most of the party would vote one way, most would vote another, but there were always enough swing votes to make compromises possible, and bipartisanship arose on issues central to national security and national concern. The absence of compromise is a clear marker of this kind of factionalism as well. Now, the more technical social science definitions follow. Factional polities have parochial political factions that regularly compete for political influence in order to promote particularist agendas and favor group members to the detriment of common, secular, or cross-cutting agendas. That is, political parties or factions pursue their own agendas without much regard for the impact that has on anyone else, and generally they seek to dominate or win competition rather than compromise and share the gains. In general terms, factionalism refers to an advanced stage of group polarization that transforms political behavior in distinct ways that are both systematic and sustained. Factionalism transforms the conventional politics of deliberation to the unconventional anti-system politics of disruption. That's an old quote. I didn't make that up for today, but when you simply think about the amount of time that is spent in quorum calls in Hong Kong's Legislative Council in the past couple of months, that's what they mean by kind of systematic and sustained forms of political behavior that are unconventional and anti-system. So when you see a lot of behavior in political institutions that is aimed more at disruption or blockage than at forging consensus, then you know something is wrong. Now that would seem to bode ill for Hong Kong politics. You certainly do have a lot of the politics of faction and disruption. But there's another marker that is much more positive, and this comes from another vein of research with which I've been engaged, and that's the study of how demographic factors affect political systems. And one of the remarkably strong and new findings is that there's a very strong relationship between the age structure of a society, that is the proportion of the population that is young, middle-aged, or old, and the stability of its democratic system. What we find is that, as the median age increases, the proportion of countries that are ranked free by Freedom House grows very rapidly in a logarithmic curve. So for countries with a median age under 25, barely 1 in 10 to 1 in 5 rank as free. By the time we get to median age 45, 100% of those countries are ranked as free. Now, understanding the deep structures behind this relationship is still ongoing. This graph is from a publication by Richardson Cotta that appeared just last year. There have been a number of publications documenting this. You probably have seen some of the material about the youth bulge and countries that have a large youth population being less stable. That's certainly true. We see more violence and more regime change in countries that have a large youth bulge. But that's only a fraction of the phenomena. The reverse is also true. Countries that have a higher proportion of older adults tend to be more stable, and this was the surprising part, also tend to be overwhelmingly more democratic in a strongly monotonic relationship with rising age. Now, some of that, of course, is due to economic and social development. As countries get richer, they have longer lifespans due to economic growth. However, this relationship between age and democracy is robust when you control for level of development. I have a paper that will, I hope, come out next year. It's in Revised and Review, in which I demonstrate that if you do a regression on the stability of democratic regimes using both median age and real income per capita, the real income per capita washes out and becomes insignificant. It's the age structure variable that is more powerful. And that's a bit of a shock to conventional political science, which has always seen development and democracy as linked together. But that doesn't appear to be the case. Rather, it appears that there are issues of parochialism and patrimonialism that encourage people to have large families and that also work to undermine democracy. Once the parochialism and patrimonialism is replaced by a broader, more universal ethic and by self-reliance through civic associations, birth rate drops, and those civic associations and the universalism can underpin a stable democracy. And Hong Kong is already at median age 42.1. So if Hong Kong were to become a democracy in the full sense, it is not yet there, it would, by this finding, tend to be highly stable, highly resilient. Even China, with median age already 36, is in some sense overdue for transition. Now, we do find that countries' transition to democracy is not so dependent on age structure as their ability to remain democratic. So for any number of reasons, the persistence of a unified party government, military threats, economic reversals, high levels of corruption, any of these reasons can lead countries to stay in an authoritarian state longer than you would expect. Singapore, for example, has gone through modernization and development, still remains a dominant one-party state. They do that partly through emphasizing the threats that Singapore has faced from a hostile neighborhood. Similarly, in China, the regime has shifted from using a Maoist legitimation to much more of a nationalist legitimation and standing up for a century of humiliation at the hands of the outside world. Nonetheless, countries that do mature in age structure and where people feel more self-reliant, if they do transition to democracy, are very likely to stay there. And so that's what bodes well. Other countries, as you can see, are much younger. South Africa, the odds are not great. Egypt, the odds are not great. Kenya, similarly. By 2030, South Africa and Egypt probably have a better chance. Brazil is already over age 30, and despite all the troubles they're facing, their democracy should be resilient enough to get through these current corruption and other charges. So the good news is, yes, we expect that at some point China and Hong Kong will transition to full democracy and remain stable, but that day is not yet here. Why is that? Well, since I've come to Hong Kong, I've noted some of the factors that seem to be potentially polarizing with regard to politics. One is very high housing prices, which is a widespread grievance, and in particular, the shortage of public housing as well, with people living in levels of subdivided flats that are quite distressing. This is a big issue for the younger generation, that entry-level wages have not risen as fast as the GDP or as housing prices. Another is the rising level of inequality. Now, I should say these are not unique to Hong Kong. Throughout the developed world, whether you look at Europe, whether you look at America, you look at property prices in London, Manhattan, they also have risen dramatically. Inequality has grown, and entry-level wages have also stagnated. So these are general problems. They are particularly troubling in Hong Kong, however, because Hong Kong does not have the full democracy that allows people to feel they can effectively force the government, control the government to make choices. You don't have a Bernie Sanders or a Donald Trump type candidacy because you don't have open elections for chief executive. It's still a somewhat controlled process. And the danger in Hong Kong is precisely this combination of polarization plus a partial democracy that gives people a voice and encourages an opposition to be present, but still doesn't give a full democratic accountability to the government. And that is unpleasant and dangerous. Factors that are more unique to Hong Kong include the distrust of leadership in China. That is, everyone in Hong Kong seems to be looking over their shoulders these days, wondering what will happen to China's policy that will affect Hong Kong. And a distrust of Hong Kong's leaders as well. It does not seem that, let's put it this way, I don't think I exaggerate if I would say the current leadership of Hong Kong does not have the full faith and trust of as much of the Hong Kong population as they would like. There's also behind this a broad generational distrust. That is, the younger people in Hong Kong who have been particularly hit hard by the high house prices, the stagnation of entry-level wages, what they perceive as competition from mainland China. They are particularly concerned that the leadership of Hong Kong is not acting in a way that responds to their concerns and meets their interest. At the same time, older generation of Hong Kong leadership seems quite puzzled. They don't seem to understand or give credence or legitimacy to the protests of younger people, tend to label them as disruptors, people who should be ignored or worse. And so there's a kind of breakdown in communication between a younger generation and older generation, each of which kind of suspects the other of acting for particularistic interests and not looking for the kind of general interest or greater good. Oops, there we go. And of course, the general insecurity over the future of Hong Kong is affecting everyone because they want to know, who do you look for to define that future? Will 2047 mark a grave change or not? And even closer to the present, are there going to be changes in China's economy, in the relationship between China and Hong Kong, in the relationship between China and the rest of the world that will affect our prospects? I came to Hong Kong because I wanted to be here. It's an exciting part of the world. I'm optimistic for reasons I'll get to in a minute. But I understand the general insecurity. A lot of things have happened in the last 12 months that we would not have expected a few years ago. And while the unexpected is not always bad, in this case, the Mong Kok riots, various actions by Chinese and Hong Kong authorities have cast a greater concern of insecurity about the future. Nobody is quite as confident that they know what the future will bring as they might have been, say, 5 years ago. Now, in order to move toward greater stability in Hong Kong, what do I think is needed? And this is based less on my knowledge of Hong Kong than on my broader comparative and historical understanding. So please feel free to correct me, take this with a grain of salt. But as I said, I'm speaking here as a scholar looking at a variety of cases and go from there. So clearly, to move to stability, a vision of growth that is inclusive, so that all major professional, generational, regional groups within Hong Kong feel that there's a vision for Hong Kong's future that has a place for them. It's very distressing and falls back under that political exclusion category I highlighted earlier if people feel that the future of the society in which they're living does not offer a pathway to prosperity for their entire group. Now, if individuals feel frustrated, there are always things that individuals can do. Individuals can migrate, they can seek different type of training or education, they can rely on family, or they can blame themselves and turn to the comforts of various behaviors, alcoholism, drugs. That's the downside of it. But in general, in societies that are open and democratic, people who feel frustrated tend to blame themselves and look for individual solutions. in societies where entire groups of people share a common feeling that the future doesn't include them, they tend to look for opportunities to act cooperatively. And it does seem that there are groups who feel that the future of Hong Kong does not include a path to their prosperity, whether it's the youth or people who are the elderly who are worried about pensions, but a number of groups definitely feel that the Hong Kong government is not paying attention to their needs. So we need that vision. We need a plan for relations with China that builds trust. Clearly, it is difficult for people in Hong Kong to act economically, politically, if they do not know what the relationship with China is today or what it will be in the future. As long as there was trust in both China and Hong Kong that the British settlement of one country, two systems worked to the benefit of both countries, everybody was able to go about their business rather well. Hong Kongers could work on developing their society's cosmopolitan character, making money. The Chinese could work through Hong Kong to attract foreign investment, and mainland China could develop its own economic policies and so on. The anxiety on both sides is raised when mainland Chinese leaders are not sure whether Hong Kong is committed to the one country, and Hong Kong's population and leadership is not certain if China is committed to the two systems. Uncertainty about this creates distrust that is corrosive on both sides. However, at least from the pronouncements of the latest Party Congress, it appears that mainland China still wants to make the one country, two systems work. I think that most people in Hong Kong would like to see one country, two systems work if it really does preserve the aspects of the Hong Kong system that they care most about. So what does one country, two systems mean? That needs to be worked out by China and Hong Kong in a way that builds trust on both sides. Without that, I fear that the polarization within Hong Kong will continue, and economic and political decision-making will continue to deteriorate and possibly be deadlocked. Better opportunities for Hong Kong's youth are certainly necessary. It's hard to know factually how much of this constriction is real. Yes, it's certainly true that competition from outsiders has changed the availability of attractive jobs in Hong Kong. I'm here, I'm an outsider, I've taken an attractive job in Hong Kong. Hopefully, that works for the greater good of Hong Kong as we all work to make Hong Kong a center for higher education and research that is outstanding in Greater China. Yet the reality is, if I go back to my home country, United States, I grew up in San Francisco. I was born and raised there. I like San Francisco. I would love to get a job in San Francisco, but it's not easy for me either. I have no entitlement as a San Francisco native to have a job of any kind in San Francisco. I have to go out and find a job wherever I can. It might be in New York, it might be in Washington, it might be in Texas, or it might even be in Hong Kong. And so I tell young people wherever I meet them, you need to think of the entire world as your job market, because nobody anymore, whether you're in Russia or London or America, nobody anymore has a presumption or right to get employment in the place where they happen to grow up. The world has become too globalized, too cosmopolitan, and too interlocked. Yet, in a way, frightening as that is, it offers great opportunities to people who are willing to seize that internationalization. Given that young people in Hong Kong have access to half a dozen of the best universities in all of Asia, they should be able to compete very effectively for jobs in all of Asia, even though Hong Kong may be a limited market. So, in a sense, the opportunities for Hong Kong youth should be raised, but that is not just a matter of saving jobs in Hong Kong through some type of quota or ration system. Rather, it's a matter of raising the profile and opportunity for Hong Kong youth to get jobs globally. Now, two things are important for that. First, Hong Kong still sends a smaller proportion of its high school graduates to university than populations in South Korea or Singapore. That's not good. Hong Kong is sufficiently wealthy and advanced that it should send everyone who wants a college education to college or university. Rates should be considerably higher than they are. Part of that is something that can be done by policy. And the other thing is that Hong Kong needs to think of itself not just as part of China or an appendage to China, but as a global city, as a competitor for Singapore, even as a competitor for Taiwan, South Korea. Hong Kong should be training its young people to be leaders of companies and organizations around the world. No reason not to. You have great advantages in knowledge of English, growing up with a Western-style legal system, going through universities that are increasingly westernized and competitive, if not equal to most of those. It's a great opportunity system here, and I'm sure that things can be done to open that horizon. Oops. Now, compromise and progress in politics. One of the things that struck me when I first came to Hong Kong was how civilized everyone was. Even at the height of the umbrella protest, protesters and police, after the initial skirmishes, settled down to a remarkably civil and well-behaved reciprocal set of relationships. Quite remarkable compared to the shooting of people on both sides, police and others in the United States, that was going on at the same time with the riots in St. Louis and Baltimore. So Hong Kong, I thought, people at least know how to get along even when they differ in their views. But what's happened in the Legislative Council and in politics has been a really heightened polarization since the umbrella movement. A lot of blaming, a lot of fear, a lot of anxiety, and the spirit of compromise seems to have dissipated, if not disappeared entirely. So some very important laws that are, I believe, good for the welfare of Hong Kong as a whole remain locked up in Legislative Council. It took forever to get the Innovation Bureau through. Some basic infrastructure projects are being delayed. The copyright laws being delayed. Some of these things are being delayed for good substantive reasons, but some are being delayed partly because of just sheer distrust of the leadership and inability to compromise. If Hong Kong is going to remake itself for a new century, it needs to be able to legislate effectively, and that requires compromise. Now, is more protest going to help Hong Kong move forward? I think it's a valid and important question. You had some experience with protest. Last year, Hong Kong has had recurrent public protests over a number of issues: security laws, education reform. Now, I wrote one book that argues very strongly that protest is a normal and important part of democratic politics. It's a signal to politicians that they're neglecting an important part of the agenda. It's a signal to parties that there are strong popular concerns. And peaceful, organized, legal protest is so vital to democracies to keep on target that it's hard to imagine going forward without it. But one always has to pay attention to context. Violent protest usually only works if it reduces the legitimacy of the government. That is, if the government is already so hated and distrusted that if violent protest can provoke the government, it may cause the government to even lose support of the security forces or the bureaucratic elite. That is, if you have a government that is already shaky, sometimes violence can push it over the edge. But it's very unlikely in Hong Kong that any amount of violent protest would cause the civil service or the police to cease to defend the existing government. It's just a different situation here. The majority of the population in Hong Kong still accepts the government, still thinks violence and disruption is unwelcome, and so violence is likely to backlash and undermine support generally. Certainly, people are still debating the impact of the Mong Kok riots. Did it contribute to the results in the by-election we saw, or were people voting in the by-election in some ways to say we need to do this instead of riot? Now, protest in general is more effective, I'll skip to the bottom one, when teamed with constitutional actions. That is, a little bit of protest goes some distance toward change, but if protest is coupled with electoral campaigns, legislative campaigns, then it's really likely to be most effective. Nonviolent protest in the middle there is only effective if broad-based, proportionate in its actions, and clear in its goals. One of the reasons I think the umbrella movement did not gain more success is that it continued for a very long time, and the longer it went on, the less clear it was why people were still staying out in the street. What were they doing? It became almost disruption for the sake of disruption, and that rarely succeeds in creating any kind of political movement. So when you have protest that has broad support and that is clear in its goals, it tends to be effective. So the early stage where people were coming out to protest against police excesses, that had broad support. Clearly people wanted the police to back off, use less severe tactics, and that was fine. And at that point, things had been accomplished. But continuing was very unclear. And so if there's more protest, in order to be effective, it needs to focus on goals that are clearly articulated and that have broad support, and then that needs to be teamed up with constitutional actions. Now, what political solutions do I see? Well, right now, the United States, mea culpa, the United States and Hong Kong are both bad advertisements for democracy, right? One of the reasons democracy rose in a world of monarchies and hereditary emperors is that democratic countries, the Netherlands and Great Britain, started to work more effectively than their adversaries. So Great Britain was able to borrow more effectively and act in terms of its military and navy, but also in terms of its economic competition, much more effectively than France. Same with the Netherlands. They were able to hold out against all the might of France because they were able to marshal resources more effectively. Athens failed and was defeated by Sparta. Why? Because they gave in to the rantings of an extreme populist. Alcibiades was his name. And he convinced the Athenians that they should launch a terribly expensive expedition to Sicily to try and defeat their adversaries, the Spartans. And it was badly thought out, and it was economically ruinous and led to Athens' defeat. Somewhat, I should say, like Donald Trump saying America can solve its immigration problems by building a very expensive wall across the border. It would just be, I think, a huge waste of money and ineffective, and I don't think Mexico is going to pay for it. So the problems with democracies are they can indeed miscarry. And if you have democracies that are weakened either by corruption or by severe factionalism and polarization, they become very bad models. They become bad advertisements. Why should anyone else think of adopting democracy if the countries that have it are not flourishing economically, if they don't inspire trust, if they don't inspire confidence? So I think the US election will be very interesting to watch this time. We are seeing extremism and polarization, and we'll see the US political system is designed at the end of the day to force candidates back toward a moderate middle in order to win national elections. That's how the founders of the Constitution set it up. They broke the electorate into all the different states and different regions, and candidates have to win majorities in a variety of different political contexts in order to be elected. And so that usually has a moderating influence. We will see. But certainly in Hong Kong, where you don't have that, where you have functional constituencies and a legislature with very limited abilities, it becomes more difficult, I think, for the electorate to force the politicians to behave as it will. So Hong Kong's leaders, I think, have much greater responsibility here to overcome their own differences and find a way forward. Now, how does Hong Kong demonstrate that democratic institutions do work? Well, the best way is to simply be a continuing symbol of economic progress. If people feel secure in their rights, if markets are working well, Hong Kong should continue to flourish. And indeed, all those anxieties about Shanghai taking over and other cities becoming financial or tech hubs, I think that's way overdone for now. We saw what happened with the China stock market. People invest in Hong Kong because you have pretty good confidence that 10 or 20 years from now, the Hong Kong dollar will hold its value. In China right now, people are not at all sure what will happen to the renminbi. They're not at all sure what will happen to the stock market regulation. They don't know the extent of Chinese debts or how they will be treated. So all of that opacity, all of that state intervention undermines the ability of China's cities to act as innovation hubs or financial centers. So Hong Kong should flourish if it indeed keeps to its methods, but it needs the democratic institutions to work. We need a copyright law for the 21st century. We need funding for innovation and technical hubs. We need new regulations that will allow Hong Kong to create a favorable situation for the next generation economy, whether it's based on sharing services or a new generation of internet privacy or blockchain ledgers. But all of these things require new legislation in order for them to be underpinned by the quality of laws that is characteristic of Hong Kong. We won't be able to get anywhere if legislative council is still deadlocked. So, governance that gains the trust of Hong Kongers is vital, but it's vital for both Hong Kong and China. There are issues that affect both countries: migration, jobs, and fighting corruption. In all of these areas, Hong Kong and China have common interests. And yet right now, the adversarial relation between Hong Kong and China seems to be coming to the fore. I hope that the leadership of China understands that if Hong Kong's own leadership does not have the trust of Hong Kong's people, it does not do any good for China's aspirations to retain the one country, two systems model. Given the pronouncements that have just come out of the meetings of Chinese leaders, they at least seem to be committed to the one country, two systems, and they seem to want to regain the trust of Hong Kong and its leaders. At the same time, I have to be concerned because China's leaders have also been saying all the right things about economic reform in that country without taking concrete actions to create those reforms. So we will see, I think, in the next 18 months, what measures China suggests. The advice that China's leaders gave to Hong Kong's leaders: pay more attention to Hong Kong's youth. Try and build trust, build opportunities for Hong Kong's youth. Same thing I said, right? So on that we see eye to eye. But I certainly would like to see a resumption of discussions of how Hong Kong will move toward the universal suffrage that was promised and that people still do expect. If the offer that China made last summer of 2014 was not good enough, let's find something that works for both Hong Kong and that China can accept. It does no good to simply remain rigidly where we are today. I think it does no good to demand that the only alternative is to seek some type of Hong Kong for Hong Kongers or to seek independence. China seems pretty resolute against any such intimations. I think what we'd have to do is hold China to its word of respect for one country, two systems, respect for the basic law, progress toward universal suffrage. But we have to expect that that progress will be gradual. This has got to be a negotiation and a compromise, right? That's what politics is all about, finding a compromise. So that is, for me, the most important element: governance that gains the trust of Hong Kongers for both Hong Kong and China. Now, fortunately, and here's where City University, UST, Polytechnic, and so on can contribute, there are technological solutions in sight for some of the big policy problems we face. Obviously, aging is a problem. What about the resources that need to be devoted to support Hong Kong's elderly population? And frankly, that's small compared to the resources that will be needed to support China's aging population, which is a coming tidal wave. But robotics, driverless cars to provide transportation, new health technology that can be administered at lower cost. I said earlier today to someone that right now is probably the best time ever to be an elderly person or someone close to it. That includes me, so I'm glad to say that. But for people who are in their 60s and 70s and 80s today, finally, there are enough people entering those age groups to make a political difference. There are enough people entering those age groups to become a powerful consumer market. So private sector corporations will start looking for ways to serve that market. And the new advances in medicine and robotics and artificial intelligence should be just what we need to amplify the capabilities of people who are aging and lower the cost of providing for their care. So this is an area where if technology moves forward, I think we will be able to avoid the worst. For productivity, we've had a major slowdown in productivity in the developed world for the last 20 years. Now, however, 3D printing, virtual reality, and for me, what's most important, affordable renewable energy promises to change the way we do things. I really, if you see a modern thin screen TV, it makes you wonder why we ever had those big clunky cathode ray ones. I don't know if you even remember them, some of the younger ones of you. But we used to have cell phones that were like bricks and had no capability except phone calls. And now you have, handheld computers that we use as cell phones. And we're moving rapidly in other areas too. So I think someday people will look at the idea that we drove cars with fossil-fueled internal combustion engines that had to be manually steered and pedal braked as, that's crazy. That's like taking horses compared to the driverless electric vehicles of the future. Similarly, the idea that we created energy by burning huge piles of coal to heat water to drive steam turbines will also seem extremely backward compared to the future low-cost photovoltaics. We're not there yet, but I think within 10 years we'll cross the cost frontier of making these things widely affordable, and in 30 years, when we retire the last generation of nasty polluting things, people will look back at that era the way we look back at the 19th century and Oliver Twist's days in the factory. Now, we do, however, have to worry a lot about privacy and security. The same technologies that are going to make our world more interesting and responsive do raise the threat of overwhelming us. It's entirely possible that we will have monitors so that when we enter a room in our home, the climate controls respond, the lights go on. And when we leave the room, the lights go out. Very convenient, right? But it also means that somewhere in the cloud, there's a big data base that someone can use to track your movements 24/7, which may not be so good, right? And similarly, we may have wonderful technologies to track our health. We may, all wear Fitbits. We may have, automatic micro blood sampling, and all of that is great too. Except that also means somewhere there will be a big database that can tell exactly what you ate or drank or smoked in the last 12 hours. So we have to be very careful about privacy and security, and of course, you don't want driverless cars to be taken over by a nefarious source, right? So all of this Internet of Things and broadened technology requires great innovations in both policy and technology for heightened security. And lastly, we need to recognize that just as we breathe the air and drink the water, we're going to be living in clouds of digital information. Everything we do, everywhere we go, every purchase we make, all of it will create ripples in this digital cloud. We have to figure out how to make that a positive for us, how to make cities smart and responsive, how technology and innovation policy can protect us against kind of the dangers of extreme robotics, automating everything, and then not being able to control it. All right, now, I'm about to get to the end. Thank you for your patience. So what does a good outcome look like? It's a Hong Kong government that works. Less polarization, cooperation on issues for growth and equality, and improvements in the daily quality of life. Less pollution, easier transport, cheaper energy, smart cities. Also, a Hong Kong that's a model of success. If Hong Kong is not economically more successful than its competitors in China, its special role is not likely to be respected. Now, by more successful, I don't necessarily mean richer. Shanghai is a bigger city. It may in some ways have a bigger GDP, but the wealth of Hong Kong is not simply in its GDP figures. Hong Kong is the channel for more than half of the foreign direct investment in China. It is a source of more than half of the kind of intellectual capital through universities in Greater China. It is the area through which contracting and secure and trustworthy accounting and securities exchange is conducted. Hong Kong is the largest market for initial public offerings. Why? Because Chinese companies don't offer their IPOs on Chinese markets, they offer them on Hong Kong markets. So those advantages need to be successful. So in that sense, like I say, we need to think about competing with Singapore. How do we as Hong Kong become a world important player? And that means relying less on mainland China. Sure, it was easy to make money being the trade and service provider for the mainland. But that's not going to be enough in the future, both because China itself is slowing down and because more of the basic functions that Hong Kong carries out, merchandising, retail, trade, those can be carried out in China. So Hong Kong needs to figure out ways to maximize its value to the world, how to market innovations, how to sell talent, how to sell ideas that will be global. If we do that, then Hong Kong's future, I think, is assured, because China will also not want to mess with a Hong Kong that's a great success. And I'll close there. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jack, for that fascinating talk that puts the issues that all of us are concerned with here in Hong Kong in a very interesting comparative perspective. I'm sure there'll be questions, and we have time to take a few. Is there a question from the floor?
I saw a few hands go up earlier today. Raise your hand high so I can see. Yes.
Okay, thank you very much for that very interesting talk. I enjoyed very much. My question, first question is, what's your definition of democracy? Because I saw that you put partial democracy with factionalism, but why no faction autocracy? Because I would think that that might also matter. And what is the, where does the autocracy, the partial autocracy start or end, and the partial democracy begin? Correct. That is question number one.
Okay.
Only
2 questions per intervention.
Okay. So the second one is just about Hong Kong, because I'm interested in Hong Kong. And so I think that maybe one problem is the hierarchical relationship between Hong Kong and China. So building trust and these issues could be affected by the fact that Hong Kong is just a special administrative region and not a country. And so you can't really build that kind of trust, and also maybe difficult in achieving what you mentioned at the end, that relying less on mainland China. Okay, thank you very much.
The question on partial democracy is a good one. It's definitional. And partial democracy means countries that have certain democratic practices. So they might have elections, but not everyone is eligible to be a candidate, or not every group is eligible to vote. They might have political parties, but the political parties are organized on the basis of ethnicity or around individuals rather than based on issues. So the polity scale, which ranks countries from -10 to +10 on basis of a wide range of characteristics, if a country is if it's from 0 to +6, we consider it a partial democracy. 0 to -5 is a partial autocracy, and below is, so that's just a social science metric that's widely used. Now, the question about Hong Kong is more interesting. Does Hong Kong's subordinate position limit it? Here, I think the perspective of the United States is very useful, and something I do hope we can communicate more broadly. In the United States, most of the economic energy and much of the best public policy comes at the level of states and cities, rather than the federal government. United States federal government has gained a great deal of power and wealth since World War II, but much of that is still focused in two areas. One, providing for defense, and second, providing for health and welfare for the poor and elderly. Now, Hong Kong has two big advantages compared to the United States there. You don't have a defense budget, and you have a much more efficient health system. But the principle in the United States that most of the important economic initiatives are developed and funded locally still kind of applies. You think of Hong Kong as just another city in China. Okay, but what lay behind China's dramatic economic rise from 1980 to 2010? It was precisely the initiative of local governments, because China's system, despite being a one-party state, was in practice very decentralized with regard to economic policy. Local areas were basically told, meet this GDP target and do whatever it takes, and we won't look too closely. Unfortunately, that led to corruption and pollution, but it also led to a lot of energetic and creative efforts to find opportunities for development, to direct resources to growing companies. That now is being overturned in China. In order to cope with concerns about corruption, concerns about pollution, but also concerns about popular discontent, the central government is reaching out and limiting the independence and initiative of cities and provinces across China. It may achieve its goals with regard to corruption, might even make progress on pollution, but it's definitely going to limit local initiative. Hong Kong, because we're a special autonomous region, doesn't face, at this time, and I hope not for a long time, doesn't face that kind of very strong central control that is emanating from Beijing. So we have a lot more freedom to pursue lines of development that we think are helpful. Now, can we screw it up? Sure. If it were the case, for example, that pollution in Hong Kong gets a lot worse, while in Beijing and Shanghai it gets a lot better, our system would not look very good, right? Similarly, if innovation hubs develop elsewhere and not here, then we would look like we're only protecting kind of past successful industries and not building new ones. So it's crucially important that Hong Kong take advantage of its freedom in the hierarchy to innovate, act creativity, forge its own economic links around the world, to do things that will be much more difficult now. Now, some of these new rules that China is advancing puzzle me. If they're going to control all internet content and want all internet content housed in China, how are academics in China going to read scientific journals online? How are their students even going to, apply for fellowships in foreign universities? Or how are they going to submit their manuscripts to international journals? None of that's housed on Chinese servers, nor will it ever be, right? So probably China may not be enforcing all of those rules strictly, but they sow a lot of confusion, a lot of anxiety, and I think people will often react by choosing not to do what might be regarded poorly. And so I think you're going to see mainland China be less energetic, less cosmopolitan, less able to respond quickly to international opportunities than Hong Kong. So in that sense, our position in the hierarchy could be a definite advantage. Yes?
Thank you. Dan Garrett, City U, PhD student. I agree with your observation regarding the political factionalism, although in Hong Kong we have two types. We have Beijing down, and then we have Hong Kong factionalism. But more fundamental than that, Hong Kong is, based on my research, is a deeply divided society. It is approaching, if not already embracing, sectarian conflict, if not ethno-nationalistic conflict, which brings a different, as you know, a democracy in those types of environments are very difficult.
Correct.
And plus we've had, nobody really talks about it, but basically we have 3 decades of a conceptualization of one country, two systems, a hegemonic one and a subaltern one, and there's never been any reconciliation. So this polarization that you mentioned that has occurred from Occupy arguably dates back even further before the handover, but even with Occupy, we've had 3 years before and after Occupy of mass line mobilizations against that. So once again, you have these factors feeding into Hong Kong as a deeply divided, polarized society, but there's no discussion of, like in Northern Ireland or these other types of situations, how do you have a peace council? How do you do reconciliation? Thank you.
Well, I think the liaison office has woken up to the risks of continuing to disregard the grievances of Hong Kongers against the mainland. They see that that's not been productive. It could even lead in the direction of Taiwan, of anti-China political parties gaining strength. So they are seeming to take action. For example, the unrestricted migration or movement of purchasing agents from the mainland to Hong Kong is now being limited, I understand. The concerns about the opportunities for Hong Kong's youth have apparently reached the ears of some of the leaders in Beijing. I don't know what they will do with it beyond broad sloganeering, but if they're sincere and they want to encourage Hong Kong's leadership to pay more attention, that's a good thing. It's too early to say. I think the points that you raise, yes, there's been much more sectarian character of politics. The notion of a Hong Kong for Hong Kongers, hostility to the mainland, hostility to Putonghua, anxiety about the press, all of this feeds into an environment that is destructive for both sides. When you say, you mean from the mainland or from
the mainland,
yeah.
and also from the Hong Kong SAR government in the so-called patriotic camp. You have people like Regina Ip that assert there is no such thing as a Hong Kong people or the Hong Kong identity.
Yeah.
So you have a social talk conflict also.
Right. For what it's worth, my Institute for Public Policy is organizing a short course for Hong Kong civil service on cultural identities, try and give them a better grasp of this. There's nothing wrong with having a Hong Kong or Macau identity. I think the real issue is, like Shanghai people have an enormously strong Shanghai identity, right? Which is often at least as hostile to Beijing as ours is in some ways, right? So there's nothing entirely wrong with it as long as it can be cast in terms of a desire to see Hong Kong keep its unique character, excel at what it does best, and be a model for the type of society that most Hong Kong people want to see. Now, if that can't be done in the context of one country, two systems, then a whole series of problems arise. But I still believe that most of that seems that can be done within that context as long as the basic law is respected by all parties. So the Hong Kong identity only is a problem if it becomes, deeply and vehemently anti the relationship with mainland China of any kind. Now, I could see that happening. I mean, if it were the case that the authorities in Beijing decide, for whatever reason, that they want all international finance to move through Shanghai so that they can control it, and decide they're going to shut down the Hong Kong stock market and put a limit on Hong Kong banks requiring them to keep a certain percentage of their capital in mainland. They could do that. It would be enormously self-defeating, destructive, and crazy to do it, but they could do it. If they did, I think then we really would see a much more broad-based, widespread, free Hong Kong, anti-mainland attitude. But as long as China wants to benefit from the special character of Hong Kong, as long as it acts rationally in pursuit of its self-interest, I think it will respect the aspects of one country, two systems that we care about most. Now, are there problems? Did they overstep with some of the things like the action against the booksellers? One could well argue that that's not acceptable. At the same time, they could argue that if the booksellers were in fact, as is alleged, smuggling banned books into China for profit, that's not acceptable either, right? Now, the whole point of having a liaison office and having, serious adults manage the relationship is to deal with the inevitable misunderstandings and excesses that will arise on both sides of a relationship that has a certain built-in amount of ambiguity and difference in views. Question simply is, can incidents that go across what people on one side consider reasonable be managed so that people step back from that? And so I would say if you see a trend of either Hong Kong or China acting in ways that the other side regard as a growing pattern of ever greater violations of the one country, two systems model, you will see an aggravation of all the polarization problems, conflicts, and dangers. On the other hand, if you see a back and forth, so that there's some testing and some criticism on both sides, but an effort to step back and maintain the balance overall, then I think it will still be okay. Yes, and back.
Thank you. So I have been in Hong Kong 25 years, and I sometimes ask myself the question of what has disappeared in Hong Kong that was keeping functionalism at bay? And I have three theories which I would like you to comment,
Sure.
maybe because you can see.
I'd love to hear them.
So the first one would be there was, and this may sound a bit bigotic, but it's not, an external master that was respected because was not one of us, and the emphasis should be it was not one of us. The second one was a common language of debate that kept relationships different, and that was English. For example, in the legislative chamber, people were debating English, they kept themselves a little more restrained. And then a deeply meritocratic society, which I think is definitely disappearing, and we see that mirrored in institutions. So I wonder whether, I mean, the literature, what you know, the work of other people who have been looking at functionalism, how does functionalism emerge, and what has disappeared in Hong Kong that has brought this functionalism? And perhaps these are few reasons, but may not be all.
Look, I think Hong Kong would benefit from a deep, thoughtful debate on the causes of factionalism and what are the ways to deal with it. I had not heard that I had heard, of course, that the English language was suffering from reduced use at all levels of Hong Kong society. That concerns me because it's one of Hong Kong's international advantages. But I hadn't heard the theory that government conducting more of its business and public imaging in Cantonese leads to a greater factionalism or cultural conflict than doing so in English. It's an interesting idea, definitely worthy of study, but I can't comment on that for sure. The reduction of meritocracy is clearly a big issue. Now, sometimes meritocracy itself is not great if people don't feel they have equal access to the ladder by which meritocracy works. I mean, you could have America is becoming a meritocratic society much more than it used to be, but it's also one where access to the higher levels of the meritocracy is increasingly constricted by neighborhood or family in which you grew up. Very simply, among lower class families, one-parent households are much more common. One-parent households are much less likely to have children who do well in meritocratic competition. So that, meritocracy isn't always the answer, and by itself it isn't. Now, if, however, it is the case that people had faith in the value of effort and merit and earned rewards, and that faith is being eroded, that undermines trust. So whether it's a matter of restoring the meritocracy, if it's the case that favoritism or nepotism is taking over, or increasing access to the rungs of the meritocracy if people feel they're being excluded, I think both of those are important. Again, one of Hong Kong's great advantages compared to other Chinese cities is the world looks at Hong Kong as a place where objective results, transparency, rule of law in a objectively enforced, trustworthy court system prevails. Now, if that is lost, Hong Kong loses enormously. And I think, if the factionalism is just one part of it, one symptom of that. So I think the things you highlight, to the extent they're problems, require immediate response and attention.
Thank you. As you mentioned that Hong Kong can learn from Singapore and relies less on China, I'm wondering whether the chief executive of Hong Kong has as much freedom or autonomy as other countries of even small countries' leaders to maximize his or her governance place to become more globalized. You know that China may even not want to Hong Kong to become more globalized, because more globalized may imply that it is hard to control. On the other hand, under the current system of the selection of the chief executive, I think that the chief executive need to pay attention to the CCP's idea, because CCP has almost control who can become the chief executive.
Yeah.
So under this system, how can Hong Kong become globalized in the official level?
Right. Well, there are a number of things to look at. Question number one is, does the chief executive in Hong Kong have the same authority that leaders of other countries do? No, certainly not. But in some ways, that's an advantage. Like you don't have to worry about your defense budget the way that other countries do, right? You don't have to worry as much about the tax regime. You're in a country that makes a point of keeping taxes reasonably low as possible, and you keep expenses low. You know, let me tell you, leaders around the world would love to be able to set a tax rate as low as Hong Kong. So in that sense, Hong Kong has more leeway. Certainly with regard to openness on information, the basic law creates the advantages of a constitution in a way that many other countries around the world lack. So I think despite, as I mentioned, the subordinate position of Hong Kong SAR in the greater Chinese system, the fact that it is a special autonomous region means that the chief executive and leadership of Hong Kong do have the authority to do what I think is necessary for Hong Kong to remain free and economically successful. Now, the drawbacks, unfortunately, are that the current system, the Legislative Council, is less representative and less powerful than elected parliaments elsewhere. That limits what Hong Kong can do to the extent that it undermines trust in the Hong Kong government. So I think one area of reform is to think about how the Legislative Council can be more effective in both legislating for Hong Kong, but also getting popular support in Hong Kong. As far as the chief executive position goes, I think we've seen throughout Hong Kong's history that regardless of how chief executives are chosen, if they lose the confidence and support of the people of Hong Kong, they can't be effective and they often can't last. So that freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly has been a useful check on the competence of chief executives. Now, will it continue to be so in the future? I think as long as protest remains orderly, widely supported, and nonviolent, it can continue to be an important part of Hong Kong's democracy. The risk is that if protest becomes violent, narrowly supported, and unpopular, then all protest right goes under a cloud and may be repressed, and that would be very bad. Whether or not the chief executive is nominated under control, here I think you have to realize a couple things. China will not allow a chief executive of Hong Kong that it feels does not understand the interest and needs of mainland China and does not support the allegiance of Hong Kong to China. I think that's going to be a requirement. At the same time, China needs to understand that Hong Kong will not run well, will not be an asset to China with a chief executive that does not have the confidence and trust of the people of Hong Kong. And so far, China would like to somehow square that circle and combine it, and they haven't figured out how to do that. They thought, I think, their offer to have a universal suffrage election to choose among candidates that were nominated by China was a way to create that duality. That is, China would select, mainland China would select candidates and allow the people of Hong Kong to vote, and that way the people of Hong Kong would at least be able to choose the most trustworthy or the most popular or the best liked of the candidates that China offered. Now, if China offered no candidates that had any respect or support within Hong Kong, they would take a huge risk. They would risk protest, they'd risk write-in ballots, they'd risk ballots that were turned in blank, which would all be a big embarrassment. So I think that system did motivate China to provide candidates that would have some range. I look at what happened with Iran. Iran is not a democracy, really. Very strict control over the candidates. Nonetheless, every presidential election in Iran has produced a surprise outcome. And sometimes an outcome that confounds the people that we think of as the ultimate spiritual and secular authorities. Even in the last round of parliamentary votes in Iran, reformers with the deck stacked against them scored a considerable victory. In Poland, when the communist government in Poland in the 1980s tried to set up an election that would work in their favor, solidarity ended up sweeping. Even just now in Myanmar, the generals tried to set up a system that would control the elections and failed. So once you allow popular suffrage to take root, I think it does put real constraints on the system and leads to evolution in ways that make it harder for authoritarian governments to stay in control. So I'd like to see some movement back toward that, even if it means mainland China having a dominant role in nominating the candidates. I still think universal suffrage for choice is a benefit, is worth thinking about. Now, I don't know if we can go back to that, but I think it's absolutely vital to restore trust, to have conversations resume on how to do something to replace the reforms that were rejected.
My question is similar to the last one, but I'd like you to comment more on, I guess, the implications of Hong Kong's special status on theory building rather than policy. I mean, you've introduced to us, I shouldn't say introduced, some of you may be familiar with it already. You've introduced to me very interesting international research. How does, but it strikes me that Hong Kong might be a bit of a square peg in a round hole since it isn't a sovereign state. How much slippage is there as a result that you need to be wary of in applying lessons from international comparative research and trying to apply it to Hong Kong, which is neither a state nor is it simply local government. It's not something more than just a city.
Correct. Look, it's a superb question to ask. That is, whenever scientists try and generalize about any entity, one always has to ask, is there a core identity among the entities you're looking at or not, right? So can you make a law of species that applies to all species of all orders and genus or not? Or are there some that only apply to higher order and so on? Political scientists routinely talk about states, right? But states are not all comparable. And one of the things that upset me was when there was a political scientist in Washington, Center for Development, Steve Radlett, who talked about success in Africa, that so many African states are becoming democracies, and this should cause us to rejoice at the progress of democracy on the continent. Well, yes, but it turned out that half of those emergent democracies were, Cape Verde and other tiny island states, right? South Africa was deteriorating, DRC was collapsing, and so on. So clearly, when we talk about national characteristics, what applies in large territorial countries may not apply in small island states. But this is not just, can you generalize about Singapore and Fiji and Solomon Islands from what happens elsewhere, right? Is Singapore different because it is a special autonomous region? Pardon me? I'm sorry, Hong Kong. My mistake. I apologize. Is Hong Kong different because it's a special autonomous region or because it is a territory of 7 million and a predominantly urban society? That also makes it different from many other large ones. I think it's entirely empirical. I was cheered a bit, although depressed by the fact, but cheered theoretically that when we had revolutions in the Solomon Islands, for example, they did seem to conform to the kind of causal model that I'd developed from looking at larger countries. So when it comes to something like economic development, does it make sense to say, is there a need for a developmental state to support the advancement of science and technology? Well, here's my finding. In very large and diverse territorial states, maybe not. You have a country like the United States, or you have a country like France or Britain. Does it require a strong hand of government to try and promote new industries? The answer is probably not, because the domestic market and the availability of domestic capital is sufficiently large that those things spring up on their own. But if you look at Ireland and Israel and Singapore, and Taiwan, Korea, in all of those cases, relatively small economies that were dependent on international markets, it was very important for the government to adopt fairly strong and aggressive policies to support innovative enterprises and penetration of foreign markets. So I would say if we look at Hong Kong, what matters for Hong Kong is the relative size of the economy and the objective of its markets. And I'd say Hong Kong is more like Israel or Korea or Singapore or Northern Ireland. You need a strong technology and innovation policy to support the economy. You might not need the same policy in Canada or the US or Brazil. So you're quite right. One always has to look at the characteristics of the place you're talking about, but you don't have to assume that because there are not that many SARs in the world, we don't know anything. There are a lot of respects in which Hong Kong is similar to other entities that we can study. All the way in the back and then the front.
I hear a mention of cosmopolitan city, and that's why I want to ask some questions about social ethos.
I'm sorry, you hear mentions of?
The cosmopolitan,
Yes,
Hong Kong as
right.
a cosmopolitan city.
Yes.
And that's why I have some questions about social ethos and Hong Kong's social ethos and its development. Because what you saw is that you had the materialistic values of Hong Kong under S.K. Lau, which was outlined by S.K. Lau. And you saw in the 2003 protests that the PRC tried to soothe the Hong Kong population by giving it economic advantages, which again led to Hong Kong rising after SARS, right? But now you see that for the UM and you see the riots in Mongkok, etc., that the discontent is growing quite rapidly. For the young people, their social ethos is completely different from that of the older generations. So do you think that there are any possibilities to find unity between the PRC that still regards Hong Kong as following traditional Chinese values and the intellectuals and the young people that are post-materialistic, that believe in the betterment of the Hong Kong society? Do you think there's any way to find unity between those two camps?
Not easily. It is critical, and I think it's quite interesting and I think positive, for example, to see younger people running for office in Legislative Council. I think I had lunch with, I guess, the Deputy Minister for Constitutional Affairs, who's a recent young Stanford graduate, Hong Kong native, but a recent graduate from Stanford. You know, the more young people get into positions where they can influence what happens in Hong Kong, the better, right? So founding tech companies, getting into government, going into higher education, all of these are avenues where people can have an impact. The protest, I hope we'll look back and say these protests were a useful signal of the degree to which Hong Kong government and business elites have lost touch with the needs of a large segment of Hong Kong's population. I mean, looking back, it seemed that Hong Kong's elites had it fairly easy during the days when even the kind of normal shopkeeper in Hong Kong had a much higher income and better life than most residents of China. Things always looked better looking across. That's no longer the case, right? Guangzhou and Shenzhen are starting to look as rich or richer than Hong Kong. Now, for the richest people in Hong Kong, things are still fine, right? But if it's no longer the case that the average person in Hong Kong thinks of him or herself as better off than the average person in China, then we have to ask why. And if they start to think of themselves as worse off, then we have a real problem, right? So young people are kind of making, these calls for attention that are important and sincere, should not be dismissed as, well, troublemakers. I think there are real issues that we see in the data with regard to social mobility, income levels, inequality. Now, I can see a wonderful future for Hong Kong. Let's say Hong Kong's leaders realize, we can't compete just on the old trade and finance. We need to develop innovative economies. We need to plug into the global economy. We need to focus on competition with our peer entities. And with mainland China being held back by information restrictions and internal conflicts of whatever kind in the Communist Party, if China's leadership, if Hong Kong's leadership can get its act together, reorient itself to building a stronger future, integrating different elements of Hong Kong's population, add that to the existing advantages in intellectual and human capital and rule of law, Hong Kong should again, every 20 or 30 years, Hong Kong reinvents itself, gets out of trouble and goes forward, and Hong Kong's people are resilient. I've been impressed with how much people who live here really do love Hong Kong and want to keep it special and want to make it move forward. So I can see the path toward doing that. So I'm hopeful that that's what will happen. But of course, it could go badly, and I'm here to try and tell you about what I think policy can do. It's got to be active. We can't just sit back and assume that everything will be okay, because that's the only certain way to make sure they don't get better.
You are talking about the link between age of the society and the stability of democracy. One question is there also a link between age of the society and stability of non-democratic system? And isn't it that if you have a big group of young people or part of the society, that the probability of mobilization in the society and desire for change is also greater? And second question is you were talking about factionalism, and you were talking about different type of protest leading to different type of outcomes of or probability of success of those protests. My question is there a relation between the reasons behind the mobilization, the way how the mobilization developed, and then the structure of this factionalism as a result of that?
Yes, very good questions. First of all, on age structure, you don't see a stability of authoritarian regimes varying based on age structure, but what you see is a recurrence. So for example, an authoritarian regime could be driven to adopt more democratic institutions for any number of reasons. It might be a change in, you could have a coup d'etat where the coup leaders want to make friends with America for whatever reason, so they adopt some democratic institutions. You could have a labor protest that overthrows an existing government and the Workers' Party starts to take power. But where you have a very large youth population, anyone else can come along and mobilize the youth for further change, and the recurrent instability often leads people to look for a strong leader to restore order. So for example, what happened in Egypt, when you had a youth-led revolution against the Mubarak government, but it didn't stay democratic very long because the society quickly polarized between the supporters of the Muslim Brotherhood and the supporters of the military, and the military managed to persuade people that the Brotherhood was dangerous, and then people came out in the streets to demand the military take over, right? The opposite of what had happened 2 years earlier. So it's very hard to get a society with a very large mobilized youth component, so large that it intimidates and frightens, right, older generation. Very hard for those societies to be both open and stable. The second question about type of protest. Protest that has a clear policy goal. We want the government to change policies on X, Y, or Z, often can be quite successful, and in democracies usually are successful to some degree. protests that are more radical, that say we want to get rid of the government altogether, we want to change the system, we want our area to secede, or we want our area to change from democracy to communism or communism to democracy, those kind of protests are much less likely to succeed, but much more disruptive when they do succeed. So that's an entirely different kind of situation. One of my first papers, I looked at all US protest movements that had kind of radical goals versus those that had policy goals. And almost all of the protests that had policy goals succeeded sooner or later. Sometimes in a few years, sometimes it would take 20 or 30 years, but usually if their goal was to change a policy, if the movement lasted long enough, eventually society would come around. I mean, even in the United States with gay and lesbian rights, they achieved success. Gun control, not yet, right? But you can foresee a future someday when maybe gun control advocates will have more success than they have now. But as long as they are focused on a particular policy goal and don't threaten the whole system, they're usually not repressed into non-existence and they can continue. But if you have protest movements that are really seeking to change the system as a whole, those are generally seen by governments as dangerous. They try and repress them. And then if the broader society supports the government, those movements disappear. But if the broader society is so alienated from the government that they support the extreme protesters, then you start to see a revolutionary movement develop, and that's a radical change. But that also invites international intervention, which can create further repercussions.
I think we have time for one more question.
Thank you very much for your talk today, Professor Goldstone. I'm actually from UST and PhD student working on environmental politics in China.
Nice to see you here.
Thank you. I came for your talk. So I actually have two questions, very short ones. So for the first question, I'd like to ask you to comment on the relationship, but for the environment sector between mainland China and Hong Kong. Do you see a similar role that Hong Kong could play in terms of exporting its expertise? Second question is more general. It's about your Institute of Public Policy. So would you like to share a little bit more with us about the role the Institute is going to play?
Well, I appreciate that invitation. First of all, on environmental policy, China, mainland China, already has a great deal of expertise. And on the technical side, they certainly have a number of outstanding experts. What they may lack is expertise on things like green finance, finding ways to structure capital to support environmental improvement. They probably lack ways to effectively monitor compliance with environmental regulations. So I think there's some areas of policy and support as well as technical areas. I mean, if UST is able to develop environmentally friendly solar cells, which is one of the things that we're doing, then that could be a great benefit for China. Unfortunately, a lot of the current ways of making solar cells are badly polluting and involve toxic chemicals. So lots of expertise could be helpful. Whether or not they will take it is a different question, but I'm hopeful, all right? Now, as far as what the Institute is doing, I think I'll try and give a short answer. The goal of the Institute for Public Policy is to bring a graduate training and policy research center to Hong Kong of the character that you see in professional policy schools at leading universities in the US and Britain. And increasingly, maybe Japan and parts of Europe. That is, schools that offer a 2-year professional Master of Public Policy degree with very high-level analytical training. So we will offer that kind of 2-year full-time, very rigorous degree. Right now, that's not offered anywhere in Hong Kong. Second, we will have an institute that is devoted to evidence-driven analysis of public policy, particularly in technology-relevant areas. So policy for internet and digital issues, policy on the issues relating to biology of aging and fiscal characteristics of dealing with an aging society, looking at science and innovation policy, sustainability and sustainable growth, climate and energy policy. Now, there are other universities, including City University, that are very good in that. But I also would like to see more cooperation among the different universities in Hong Kong. I think that's starting now. Maybe 10 years ago, the universities were more siloed and kept to themselves. But we really have a remarkable collection of university talent in Hong Kong, and we should make the most of it by collaborating wherever we can. I hope this Institute of Public Policy that I'm developing will be a focus for collaboration with other policy professionals and programs in Hong Kong.
Jack, I wanted to again thank you, and your speech alone represents one step at least toward greater collaboration. And also thanks again for this perspective on Hong Kong. Thanks to everybody for coming and their questions. Thank you.